We will bring this study session to order. And JR, would you like to take this over, sir?
I will take this and hand it off to Eric Shear.
Sorry. Yes, that's what I meant. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the study session that we have scheduled regarding short-term rentals. As council is aware, we had put an urgency ordinance in place, going back to January, and had to extend it a couple of times, to one, due to COVID, two, due to research we have to do. So we really appreciate the council and the community's patience while we brought together the information that we're going to share with you tonight. I know Eric Shear has helped put together a presentation, but I'd also like to thank Gabriel Rivera, who has done a large amount of the research and looking at what some of the other agencies have in place, and we've taken some of those and mirrored what our proposal is for consideration for council tonight. So with that, in the onset, I'll see if there are any. I know we've shared at least a draft with council of what tonight's presentation was going to look like, but are there any questions at the beginning before? Would you like to have the presentation and then hold your questions until after?
Council? Okay, I think we'll hold it till the end. Once the study session's over, then we'll bring up our questions then.
Very good. Eric?
Sure. Let me go to share screen real fast so we can bring up the PowerPoint. And everybody can see that okay, correct?
Yes.
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 Okay, thank you. So as Bob mentioned, back in December actually is when the council had put this on an agenda just for a discussion point. There were at the time two short-term rentals that were causing some problems in the neighborhood. So we have resident concerns that were raised with council. So we brought it back in December of last year, and then the city council officially imposed the moratorium in January. That was a 45-day moratorium per state law. So March 2nd, right before COVID, we extended it with the expectation that we were going to have a study session with in person with the hosts and the public, so that we could get their input. But obviously with COVID, everything got put on hold. And then we have a new council, obviously, right around the same time. So then in August, we brought it back to this council with the last extension of that moratorium. And at that time, we had explained to the council that if something had changed drastically in a short amount of time, we would have an in-person study session, but it didn't look likely, and that we probably would have to proceed with something like what we're doing tonight. So since then, staff's explored other rental ordinances, and as Bob mentioned, a lot of hard work by Gabe. I think we looked at about 10 different other cities' ordinances to see, some were big like Santa Monica and beach cities, which have restrictions that wouldn't really apply to Laverne. And then at the end of Upland recently adopted an ordinance that was similar, that was a lot more well suited to what we felt our needs were. And so ours is mostly modeled after the Upland model, but we did look at what other cities were doing and kind of see where there was similarities and then some outliers in terms of what those rules were. And then on October 28th, we sent a letter to all known hosts of short-term rentals about the fact that we were drafting this ordinance, about this study session tonight, and generally what some of those key requirements that staff is proposing be in this ordinance. We also sent it to anybody that had spoken at any of those moratorium meetings, either in support of or opposed to short-term rentals. So we made sure that even non-hosts that had engaged in some type of form or another were aware of these changes in this meeting for this presentation. Please feel free to stop me too if you catch something that you would like to be better explained. Okay, so we put the moratorium, and at that time we had identified 21 short-term rentals in Laverne. That was mainly by searching the websites, right? Airbnb, VRBO, just trying to do some research on that. The ones that we were able to find and were aware of, we notified them of the moratorium. That moratorium had an exception provision that as long as the property owners lived there and were able to get their adjacent neighbors to sign off on it, that they could continue to operate while the city drafted this ordinance. So 3 of them have received that exemption, and then some others were denied, mostly because they were unable to get all the surrounding property owners to sign off on it. And since then, the city's responded to 2 complaints about other operating short-term rentals, which the police department has used code enforcement powers to try to get a handle on those ones that were not allowed to operate under the moratorium. So the draft ordinance, we kind of thought the best way to look at this would be kind of an over-the-counter process, which if you checked all the boxes, then it'd be a staff level approval. It wouldn't require any public hearings or a longer process. It could be done at a staff level if you could check these boxes. But we also wanted to make sure we have another path for those that couldn't check all the boxes. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But this over-the-counter permit, which we're calling a short-term rental permit, would allow hosts to have short-term rentals on their property after they give us their information. Short-term rentals, as we define it, is 30 days or less. That's actually consistent with the language we already have on the books for our transit occupancy tax in the municipal code. So we wanted to be consistent with that because that does come into play with these as well. Require a floor plan so we can see the number of bedrooms that the house that they plan on renting out has. And then to documentation that this is their primary residence. This is, a key component of it to make sure that the host, that this is where they live most of the time of the year. One of the restrictions that we are proposing is that only one party may book the property per day. So that multiple different individuals couldn't book the same place. A person could book more than one room, but it would all be under one booking per day. And then that'd be a maximum of people of 2 per bedroom within the house. That's why that floor plan is important. And then up to a maximum of 10 people per short-term rental. This last one is also a requirement that we found in Upland, and that they require the host to be present during the booking. So if you plan on renting your house, the code for this over-the-counter permit would require that you be present on site at that time. So what we built into the noticing is a little bit different than what we're doing with the current moratorium. Instead of requiring them to get the signatures of all those property owners, we're modeling this after what we do for our minor exception permits in the city, which are like mini variances, in which once an application is filed with us and we find it that it's complete, we will notify the property owners within basically directly adjacent. We put 25 feet so we get the ones that are touching the property lines, but you see that within at least 25 feet. This way we could also include the people that are across the street. The width of the street wouldn't apply in a 25-foot radius, but if we extend it to 100 feet to capture those houses, we'd be getting properties 3-4 times removed. So in this way, we minimized it to 25 feet so we get directly adjacent. We also had some problems under the moratorium language with awkward configured lots of what was considered adjacent and not adjacent. So the radius distance we felt helped with that, except for those across the street. So basically staff would include those people as well. And then with the caveat that if we give it with a limited amount of time that they would have to respond, if we receive 50% or more of those notified that they were concerned about it or were objecting to the rental, then we cannot approve it ministerially over the counter, basically. It still would allow for another option. That's the second bullet point here. That if more than 50% of those notified were objected to the short-term rental, or if an applicant wasn't able to meet all of those requirements or any of the requirements on the previous slide, such as being present, they didn't want to be present at any time, they can apply for a conditional use permit. This is a process and a type of permit that we use for a lot of different things in the city. Alcohol permits for restaurants, late night uses, sometimes storage or grocery stores require CUP. It allows the Planning Commission to take a very specific look at the proposal and impose any conditions of approval that they feel are necessary to make sure that it's operated in a manner consistent with the neighborhood, right? So this really lets us put some very specific guidelines in place if the Planning Commission wishes to approve a short-term rental that doesn't meet these requirements or that more than 50% of the neighbors are opposed to. I'm going to talk about that meeting on the next slide. So it's a little bit more costly. We haven't quite established the fees for the over-the-counter permit for short-term rental, but it's going to be significantly less than this. This is a deposit because a lot of the costs associated with taking a conditional use permit, which is goes to a public hearing before the Planning Commission, is in the legal noticing that we have to do, the staff time that we have to do, writing reports and attending meetings, outside consultant costs such as the city attorney, all get charged directly to the applicant. So this is a starting deposit that we think is pretty close to what it actually costs to process this conditional use permit. Whether it be for a short-term rental or for an alcohol permit, it doesn't matter. It's the same process. And it's cost us regardless of what the outcome of that hearing is. So there is no refund of the money if it's ultimately denied. But we have to do the notice in the newspaper, and in this case for CUPs, we do a notice to all property owners within 300 feet. So a much wider net is cast in terms of notification to that neighborhood about this public hearing and the proposal for a short-term rental. And then that information we collected from the applicant will be presented to the planning commissioners. And this is important too. The public has an opportunity to submit comments before for the record, such as they have for this meeting. Also to attend that public hearing, whether it be in person or virtually at that time, to tell the commission about why they think it's a good idea or why they think it's a bad idea, to help the planning commission in their decision on that case. So the planning commission would have to make the necessary findings, and that it wouldn't have any adverse effects on the surrounding neighborhood, and that with the conditions of approval. This also is revocable, right? So if we have one goes through and is passed, and then we have constant problems or concerns, we can revoke the conditional use permit, which is another tool that it gives us in terms of enforcement that we otherwise might not have. So if you wanted to have a short-term rental in the city, you'd have to have three things from the city. Yes.
Just to interrupt, kind of, because I think you're at that point, the Planning Commission's decision is subject to appeal to the council. So it's possible that these things could go to the council.
So the three things that they would need from us is that over-the-counter permit, if that's the route they go, or an approved CUP from the Planning Commission or ultimately the City Council, a valid business license, and then the permit for the transient or occupancy tax, so we could collect those dollars from them for those rental properties. So there's also a renewal and a revocation that would be built into the ordinance. We figured that the renewal would make sense to be done on an annual basis along with the business license. That's the easiest way we have to track that. Those are done basically by calendar year. And so they would have to notify us or apply for that renewal, at least 30 days before the expiration, pay the permit fee, and then it's good again for another 1 year. And then if they don't submit the complete application prior to the expiration date, it could result in denial of the renewal. The code also has what happens if a permit is denied, basically outlining what an applicant's options are, including appeal of that denial. So that's built into that too, as we normally have for these type of permits. And here where we talk about revoking a permit is that if there's violation of the ordinance or the CUP, that the permit can be revoked, and that they would have to wait a year basically until they can apply for a new one. So we also in the code put some responsibilities on the hosting platforms, and they actually asked for this. We've been in contact with primarily Airbnb legal team, but they are fine imposing the city's ordinances, but they want to make sure that it's consistent with how they operate, and that they have that authority once we adopt an ordinance. So we put some requirements on them, such as collecting and reporting the TOT collections. That way we're not having to go chase after those dollars. They're done when somebody books the room through the hosting platform. Also giving us quarterly information, such as where ones in the city are listed. That way, if there are ones that have escaped us, we have a report that's telling us where maybe new ones popped up. And maybe it's something that somebody didn't know they needed a permit from, but at least that we have something to track it from through them. And then we also have this city issued registration number that will be required to be posted on the listings. That helps us to track the individual properties, because they don't, on the listings, they don't list the physical address of the listing. So we need to make sure we have a way to track what the listing is to an actual application that we have here. So that's something that Upland did as well, right, Gabe?
Yeah, that's right.
So as I mentioned, we encourage feedback from hosts and also people that have expressed interest or concerns about these in the past. Got a couple of slides here that do some question and answers, some general comments. So how will the compliance be evaluated and monitored? So we don't have staff to constantly go out and knock on doors and make sure that all these things are being applied. Just like CUPs and other kind of permits that we issue, a lot of it is based on complaints that we might receive on people that are not operating within the guidelines. So it's a complaint-only basis, but we would have the information to potentially revoke that permit if we did get complaints from the neighbors, if they were in violation. We also have the power to have the websites remove the listings if we have a violation or if we revoke a permit. So that way it literally stops them from being able to advertise their space on the primary platforms that do this. And then lastly, we have the administrative citation process, which is, an initial fine of $100 a day, and then after the second violation would be $200, and the third violation would be $500 a day that could be issued if we have one that just refuses to cooperate with us. So we would lean on the administrative citation process as well for enforcement. And the question if they only are allowed for a back house. The way the ordinance is written, it's allowed per property. So you could have your front house or your back house or both. But again, we think that the one booking per day requirement really is going to limit that. So based on your setup, you're probably only renting one of your homes, if you have multiple homes on your property, out for rental. And again, we have the host being present on the property at the time as well. And then will the owner be required to share their contact information with the neighbors? No, we would ask that if there's issues with use that they contact the police department. So the police department can investigate, write a report, and then we can follow up with the host afterwards. We're not giving the direct information to them. If they want to be good neighbors, they want to do that on their own, they can. But we're not requiring that information be given to all the neighborhood for these applications. And then why would a conditional use permit be issued if the neighbor opposed the short term? So the idea, right, if you have more than 50% of the neighbors already opposing it, why even give them the option to go to a CUP? As I mentioned before, it really is up to the vote of our planning commissioners, and they need to look at the details of the specific issues. So if there's 50% of the people opposed, but those oppositions are because they have past history, not because of real concerns about maybe an operation of an STR, the planning commission might be able to decide that with the conditions they place on that application, that they give them a chance basically to move forward. So just because 50% or more opposed doesn't mean it's ultimate, or it's going to be denied. It means they've got to go through this process, and if the whole neighborhood's against it, it's probably unlikely the planning commission would grant that permit, but it does give it to them. And as Bob mentioned, those decisions are appealable by either the host or the neighborhood or anybody in the community or the council to be able to heard before the council as well. So what's the process for the neighbors to provide the input with notice? Or is it going to be complicated was, I think, the second follow-up to that. And no, when we send out a notice that there's an application filed, we'll simply ask them to call us or email us or send us a written letter stating their concerns or opposition. That's all they have to do. It could be easy as a phone call or an email, and we will utilize that as their official opposition to count towards that 50% rule. And would the city be responsible for any damages? No. Any of these things that would happen on short-term rental, these are private properties, and whether it's being rented out for a room or to somebody else, or it was a long-term rental or a short-term rental, property issues between them are dealt on a civil matter. If there was a crime, then obviously the police department will investigate, but the city's not responsible or liable for any of those things that would occur. Those are actions by individual people on private property. So these are basically some of the general comments, nothing that staff could really respond to, just we wanted to make sure the council was aware of them. In fact, and for the record, we did forward to all the council this morning all the comments that we had received from residents. We had 9 of them, I believe.
Yes, 9.
And we have not received any since that email this morning, so there's no new concerns that have been raised to us. So one of the theories that we should just prohibit them altogether, and that was one of the things that the council was originally, given as an option when we first went to the moratorium route. But council's direction at that time wasn't that was what you wanted to do, but more look at regulating versus prohibiting. And so, but we did get that feedback. Somebody else just saying back houses or accessory dwelling units should be only allowed to be used as a short-term rental. And then somebody else that they didn't like the 1 booking per day rule that we're proposing. General concerns about short-term rentals in, traffic, parking noise, safety, disregard for neighboring properties, not knowing who's in your neighborhood, because people are coming and going at all times and frequently. A comment there needs to be hefty fines for those that are not in compliance. And I would say $500 a day on a daily basis would probably be hefty enough, I would think, to force compliance. But whether or not that's hefty enough, I don't know. But that's what we have the tools in place for. Another person thought that if one person objected in that noticing requirement, that it shouldn't be approved. Instead of 50%, that only one objection. The reason why staff felt that 50% was more fair was that, again, sometimes neighbors just don't get along for some reason or another, and for somebody to have the power to stop somebody from applying for an STR just because they have a long history of not getting along, it didn't feel fair to staff. So we felt that the majority of the neighbors, and that person can knock on doors and get the other people that have been notified to consider filing those oppositions, and they can do that work if it's important enough to them. But we didn't think it was just fair for one person to send an email in, and then that would not cause them not to be able to go through the over-the-counter process. Then a concern was raised regarding how the requirements work when there's multiple tenants on a property, because they are allowed in multi-family zones, such as apartments or mixed-use properties. And if there's a commercial tenant, does the commercial tenant get notified of their B&B or the host? And the code doesn't address that as we have it drafted today, but I think that's a good point, and we'll look at how to clean that up to try to make sure we capture that. And I do think that if there are other units on a property, that potentially those other people should also be notified at the same parcel as what's being proposed, not just the ones out adjacent to it. So I think that was a good point, and we will look to clean up our ordinance on that front. And then there was a stated preference for a good neighbor policy, which was provided in the email with a various listings. A lot of them mirror what we expect to have in the final ordinance before you, but the ordinance is obviously an ordinance and not a policy. So hosts can have their own policies, and we might look at some of these and maybe beef up some of our comments in or requirements in the ordinance. But having a policy is possible if that's something the council is interested in pursuing further. Based on that, our next steps is based on your direction this evening. We'll finalize that draft ordinance, because in August when we came to you for the extension, we asked for the full year, but we did commit to the council that we had every intention of moving quicker than that and hopefully having an ordinance to you. I think I said at the beginning of 21. So we're on pace for that. The ordinance is mostly drafted today with the things that I just went over. However, if you give us some further direction or change of direction, or would like this to be discussed at a further length, another meeting perhaps, obviously that's going to extend out when we are going to be able to bring you the ordinance. So right now, we would expect to be able to go to the Planning Commission in December, and then with the ordinance, with them making a recommendation, provided they're able to do that and they don't continue their meeting in December, we would propose the ordinance to you in January for consideration, a first reading. You know, there's a second reading and a 30-day ratification process that has to happen before it goes into effect, but that's when you would have your public hearing, would be in January for this. So with that, I know that there's one member of the public that is asked to call in. We don't have any other ones. So I know JR was going to work with them to get them on the line. So JR, if you're listening, now would be the time to start doing that. But otherwise, Gabriel and I are here. I'm sure Bob Russi would be happy to answer any questions that the council might have.
Are we waiting for the public comments first?
Well, I think we should first see if there are any general questions from council. Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, you want to go to council first, or do you want to go to public comment?
Just see if there are any initial questions that we can answer, or if you would, or that you need answered before we open it to the public.
Okay, council, do we have any questions for staff, for Mr. Scheer, or any, Councilmember Carter?
Yeah, I had a question. You know, I had a concern too until that question was brought up too. The vehicles, you figure every booking could have 10 people in the home. So that could possibly be 10 drivers. Shouldn't we have something in this so that we are addressing the parking and limiting maybe the number of vehicles for the neighbors? That's my concern too, because you could just get so many cars in a driveway. And so where else will they park? That was a concern of mine. And also, if you could just answer clarification, does the host have to be living and present just during the booking, or throughout the stay that someone's staying at their home?
Throughout, the way it's worded, that the host would have to be there throughout the stay of each booking.
Okay.
I have a couple questions.
Mr. Councilmember Crosby.
Thank you, sir. The 25-foot rule, who picks, like the city? It says a minimum of 50%. So how far can they go out? Is that the city that's picking that, or is that the host? And how many is the minimum of homes being notified? Because sometimes these homes are not necessarily so close. They pick two people. One person says yes, then 50% of the people are, then it's not more than 50%. They pick three people, only one person says no. So how many homes are notified? Who chooses them? And things like that.
Okay, so staff would be sending the notice out, so we are the ones that will choose who receives the notice. Again, the idea is the ones that are directly adjacent, right? So if you're on a corner lot, for example, you're not going to have as many neighbors next to you probably. But that's why we said at least 25 feet, because if you're on a corner lot, we want to get the people that are on the other side of the street, on that street side and in your front, over across the front of your house as well. So we found under the moratorium times that trying to craft language to apply to all the different layouts of property lines in the city, it doesn't work. So we had to leave ourselves a little leeway to do what would be reasonable. So I would say that on average, we're going to at least notify probably 5 to 7 property owners in a normal configuration of lots. But there might be a property that's so well removed that it wouldn't make sense to do more than 3 or so. It just really depends on the configuration.
You also said that it'd be up to like the websites, you working with the websites. How compliant are these websites with the cities?
They are, again, we predominantly dealt with Airbnb. We think are the number one that's known. There are the other smaller ones, but as the biggest one, we wanted to start there with our discussions. And this was many moons ago, but Bob Kress and I had a phone call with their legal team and to really get through once we did the moratorium to make sure that we were heading in the right direction. And so they've expressed full support to working with public agencies. They have a whole dedicated team just for that, recognizing that more and more cities are adopting regulations and ordinances that they're happy to. They've indicated that they're more than willing to work with us to ensure that our ordinances are followed here in Laverne.
And my last question, thank you for actually answering, I'm doing that too, is that we've had 3 people to qualify during this time, but per the public comments, and I don't know if they're true or not, that there's been many more people that have still engaged in the short-term rentals. What kind of assurance that can we give our residents if we do this, that we would be following this and not, because some great people have done, and these three families have done it, and they follow all the rules and regulations, and then supposedly there's other people not.
Bob, you want to take this one?
I was going to wait and see if you had a response to it. Frankly, we cannot guarantee that people are going to comply with the ordinance. We can enforce it if we become aware of it. That's why the unique identifier being put on the hosting sites will be important, because we'll be able to tell by that what addresses are complying and we have a permit for, and which ones are just simply advertising or attempting to advertise. And that would also put the host on notice that shouldn't be permitted, and helpfully direct us back to them. Doesn't mean we're going to catch everybody. We hopefully, people, if they see that, and as we've done up to this point, when we get the complaints, we do investigate them and try and gain compliance or request that they shut it down. But it will become a ongoing enforcement issue for us as we move ahead. So we can't make any guarantees. All we can do is continue to guarantee we will enforce the codes that are put in place.
Any other council members?
Yes.
Questions?
I have a question. Thank you. I wanted clarification on the fines. So, Eric, you indicated that it's a per day fine. So how do you track that? So is that once someone calls in to complain, or is that if we know of a applicant who's non-compliant, if they refuse to come in compliance and still want to operate, it's for every day that they, so I just wonder how we're tracking that, because I think that speaks to the question of, or the comments that we received, and I think we received a handful that wanted a higher fine instituted for non-compliant short-term renters.
So the way our admin site process works is we give an opportunity to comply. So the first notice, if you will, is going to be you're in violation of the short-term rental ordinance, and you have to get an over-the-counter permit or take out whatever process until such time you need to cease any operation. We give them an opportunity to comply with that. Should they not, and we have to do a follow-up, that's when the first notice of an administrative site will be issued, and that first fine of $100, Eric? Is that what you said?
$100 the first violation, 200, and then 500.
So it would then take monitoring on our part to, if they then have a subsequent advertisement or some way to show that there's proof, and that's where the reporting is going to come into play as well with the hosts, to see if there's been activity that has occurred.
So that first notice then that says, hey, you're not compliant, there's no fine associated with that first notice. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, there's a compliance period, and if you don't comply within that stated period, then the initial fine kicks in. As to the amount of the fines, it's been a while and I need to do some research, but that used to be regulated by state law. So I'm not sure that, we could really change those, but perhaps.
Well, I'd like to know what our parameters are then, because I do think that given the comments that we've received and that we've heard from prior council meetings, it does seem like we do have some, what I would call maybe a repeat, offender category of folks. I think they're the ones that really didn't know and have strove to comply or have ceased operations. And then I think there are those that have skirted the rules. And so I think that's where some of the frustration I think we're seeing from some of the comments from the residents is coming from, is that, that the enforcements are not going to be significant enough to get people to do what they're supposed to be doing. So I'd like to know what we are allowed to do with the fines.
And I'll certainly take a hard look at that. Generally speaking, the whole administrative citation process is set up with escalating fines and usually has a provision, which I believe you have, which would carry into this ordinance, to allow after the third violation, then violations could be actually prosecuted as misdemeanors as well.
Would that be a prosecution by the city because it's a violation of the city ordinance, or is
Yes.
it? Okay.
But I'll dig in on that and get you current, accurate answers.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Davis, any questions?
Yes, thank you. I guess a couple pieces. One is is the TOT, the tax, is that something that we can charge based on the actual stay? So if the reservation was outside the short-term parameter, but the actual stay was a short-term parameter, would the ordinance be able to impose that TOT on the actual length of stay versus the reservation?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Bob?
Okay, so then I'll keep that for my comment later because that's how I would like it imposed.
It kind of depends on how the transient occupancy tax is worded. I mean, I think it would catch what turned out to be a short-term rental that may have been, disguised as a long-term rental.
But I see the issue being if that's something that the hosting site needs to somehow be able to track, and that's where I don't know if that gets captured in a way that they know that it ended up being under the 30 days versus a long-term rental of greater than 30 days. So that's why I don't know to what ability those host sites have to track and monitor what the actual stay ended up being. We would have to look into that as well.
I would hedge to guess that those sites know everything that's going on, and so they would be able to transition from one to the other without concern. But that would be an imposition that I would certainly want to see because that's going to help us with enforcement.
Sure.
Any other questions, Mr. Davis, or comments?
Well, I'll save my comments for a little later.
Okay.
After we hear from the public.
Okay. Thank you all. I had a couple questions. The most important thing is keeping it fair for all, but also to keep it in the guise of legality to make sure that we're covering our bases and we don't going too far, but not far enough. So, and I thank you, Mr. Scheer and partner there for getting us together. I know it's taken some time, but we have a lot of concerns from the good operators, and then we have some concerns from the possibly not so good operators. So trying to get in the middle of the road here to protect all on this, but also the main concern is protecting our residents from a quiet stay in someone's home and do it legally. So there was one little question there. It said two individuals. Is there including children in that at all? It was kind of brushed by, Mr. Scheer.
So the way the ordinance currently words, it doesn't specify children, but from my prior research from other cities, most cities do exclude children from that too, just in case there's the fact that there's two parents who rent a room and then there's a child, a baby or something that they'd want to keep in the room with them. So it's something that we could definitely implement into our ordinance.
But just so the child doesn't count towards the maximum occupancy, basically.
That's what I was asking. So it does not count towards it. They can have a child with them. It doesn't exclude them if they have a child.
That's right.
Okay. I think the council's brought up some good questions regarding the TOT, also the fining, but we also have to keep in mind we have to keep it legal and keep it within line with other areas that have these ordinances. So, and the good neighbor policy, I know that Linda Wilkinson had mentioned that, and it sounds like we got a little bit of a mix of everything in here to put it together. My biggest concern was initially, it was at the time that Mr. Davis, Councilmember Davis had done it, it was something to get on the books as far as the neighbors approving this, situation and asking 6 neighbors. And I think we've honed that down. So it sounds like if there is an issue and we have neighbors that don't get along, that they can go back to the planning commission and do a variance and do that, which is good. That's good. At least they have an avenue to do that. So.
And just since you brought up the point, Mr. Mayor, and I know city attorney has taken a look, at least at this point, the draft of the ordinance that's there. I don't think you've seen or raised any concerns of there being any legal issues with what is been crafted to this point. Bob?
No. We had some give and take, and it's a draft that's in progress, and we'll take whatever questions come up tonight and address those, and as this project moves forward.
Okay. Being other questions from council, do we have people that have public comment? Mr. Russi?
I know JR says there was one. I don't know if there's been others since then. JR? Are you there? There he is.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I have Kim Herrera on the line.
Hello, Mr. Herrera. Good evening.
Hi, everyone. I've been listening to the meeting, and I want to let you know that I really appreciate all of your input and that you're listening to my comments and really investigating them. And I think they all sound good. One concern that I do have, and maybe it could appear in the wording of the ordinance, is as a host, I can't always be here at my primary residence, but I am here to meet them. And when the guest is making a booking, it's online, so we don't meet them until they arrive here at the destination. Okay, just want to let you know that. But my concern is, I have thought that perhaps I would like to expand my business and purchase another home here in Laverne, and I want to be, and it won't be my primary residence, but I want to be able to do this again in a good neighborly way. And with the wording that's being proposed now, I don't see that being open to that idea unless I was able to get a conditional use permit. So what do you think of that?
Eric?
She's correct. Yeah, I mean, if she wanted to buy a second house that wasn't her primary residence, then she would have to apply for a conditional use permit to operate at that location.
Does that answer your question?
I'm sorry, I did not hear that very well.
Mr. Shearer.
You heard my question, but what was the answer? I'm sorry.
Yes, you could operate a second location in Laverne if you did obtain a conditional use permit from the Planning Commission. Okay. But that would be the only way to do that.
Okay. And then I would go through the same process as before with the neighbors and everything that goes with it.
Basically, yes.
Okay. I just feel that that's important as residents, that we have the freedom to rent out our house, our property, how we want to within the guidelines of the ordinance and the law.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Have a good night. JR?
We do have one more that the Assistant City Clerk's going to transfer in. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I believe we have Mr. Richards on the line. Sir, go ahead. You're live.
Good evening, Mr. Richards.
There's someone there already.
Yeah, you are live. Go ahead and add your public comment.
Okay. Yes. Hello?
Hello, Mr. Mr. Richards, go ahead.
Yeah, this is George Richards. Thank you for okay.
Mr. Richards, turn down your TV or your computer.
What's that? I'm sorry. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You need to turn down the live stream, and then that way you're just listening to us. There's a delay on the live stream.
All right, hold on. Okay. Yes, my name is George Richards. I currently have a rental, short-term rental. And last January, like in my email I sent in, yeah, we went through all the process. We got all our neighbors to sign. And I would hate for them to have to go through that again. We got 7 of our neighbors to sign. We've had no problems. And I just think it's burdensome to have to go to them again and have them sign. But I'm concerned about the one booking, because we do have 2 rooms that we rent out. They're not always occupied at the same time, but they're both available. And I think that would be a financial hardship if we can only do one room at a time. I'm very concerned about that, and also we don't live on the property. We have as I stated in my letter, that our daughter lives there, and we live close to the house, and we're always there. We've never had any problems. I'm just concerned it's becoming a little burdensome to do this, because we think it's good for the city, and a lot of students come in, and we provide we've already been paying our TOT tax. We got our permit. So I'm just concerned that it's adding another burden, and we'll continue doing this, but I'm just concerned with some of the restrictions that are now being applied, when really we've been doing a good job. And like I said in my email, deal with the homes that are having problems, and let the ones that are doing it fine continue. So those are my concerns, and I heard everything, and I would like to put those comments on record. We have the letters on file, all the signatures, and I've already got my application for permit for next year. So I want to continue working with the city, and we're conscious of who stays there, and we're always there to make sure there's no problems. Those are my comments, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it. Any other people on the line, JR?
Not queued up. I'm making sure to refresh to see if there's any other further comment. Obviously, there were emailed comments that will be part of the record as well.
Mr. Scheer, can you comment on those? I mean, those are some good points. I know we talked about it already, but with the 2 bedrooms, but now the application, being that the application, you would have to do it every year. Would they have to go through the same process every year? Obviously, if they don't, then it's revoked, and then they have to go through the whole process again. Is there any way to streamline that? Just a question as far as if a person has already done that and they still have to go through the process and get the new process would be within 25 feet. What do you think about that? And then also the two bedrooms that he's discussing. Comments on that?
Oh, let me see if I can take it, Eric, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. Sure. So the renewal would not require the whole noticing requirement again, unless there's something unusual that happens during that year that we need to take it back through a process, complaints or whatever the case may be.
Okay.
That renewal would be a streamlined process. That's only for a first-time application that comes in to ensure that there's knowledge by the surrounding neighbors. The option for more than 1 bedroom use is subject to remember, that was the over-the-counter process. So there is a process. It would just require that to go through a CUP unless council wanted to change that to make it easier for over the counter. Staff looked at it and said it's reasonable to say, look, if you're doing one room rental and all these parameters, you should get it over the counter. Anything different from that, anything that deviates, you've got to go through a CUP process, because then you're feeling more like not a home that's just renting out your room, or you're becoming more of a type of business. And so that should have more of a conditional use permit process attached. That's the way we saw the distinction, but certainly open to council's comments.
Councilmember Lau.
I just have a question for clarification. My understanding of the new ordinance, or the new proposed ordinance, would be not that people are going to go collect signatures of their neighbors, but that we are actually, as the city, sending out notification, and it's on the neighbors and the surrounding residents to respond in some way. So I just want to clarify that if there are folks out there that want to rent out portions of their home, that onus is not on you to go track down your neighbors anymore. The new ordinance's proposal is that anyone who may or may not have an issue or wants to write in support of you doing this, it's on them to respond to the city's notification.
Yes. And before we go any further, can we close public comment?
There is one more that just came in that I forwarded to JR.
Okay. Let's complete this one and then close public comment. So,
okay. I was kind of waiting for JR. I did not hear that. So
yeah,
yeah.
All right, Mona, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mr. Mayor, I have Mona Ricaldi.
Good evening, Mr. Ricaldi.
Good evening. Thank you so much for taking the time to give us an opportunity to speak. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my neighbors that have been really impacted by having a negative experience with a short-term rental. And what I'd like to state in saying is that it's not that we're completely against Airbnbs. We understand and realize that it's a business opportunity and the benefits that the tax revenue can apply to the city. But our concerns come more from a perspective of safety. We have had numerous occasions that we have had to reach out to the police for various types of things. The property has not, it's just been a problem property is what I would say. From parking violations to noises to loud parties, it's been extremely disruptive. And so I appreciate that you guys are looking at this. We are probably one of the ones that started complaining before we actually had, the city had something in place. So we appreciate that you guys are, definitely taking this on and looking at that. But all of this being said, what I'd like to say is just from a resident and a longstanding resident in the city, I would like to make sure that the voice is heard that, we're okay with Airbnbs, but please make sure that there are proper, what I would say is proper consequences in the event that things aren't followed. And I heard, I've been listening online, so I understand, the fees and things, but just knowing what we've been going through on our end, it's very concerning to me that it seems like the error is in the direction that it's going to get approved with the short term. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best thing in our specific situation. And so I just hope that there is a way for us to be able to accurately or clearly, share what our voice is throughout the process if there are concerns, and that it can, the permits can be revoked based on the number of, let's say, police calls or occurrences that need to be engaged or something to that effect. That's it. Thank you.
JR, any more comments or public comments?
We haven't received any additional ones through the city clerk's email.
Or on our side.
Could suggest we go ahead and close public comment and bring it back to council. Mr. Russi, you were saying something before we went to the other person for public.
I think I was answering Councilmember Lau's point on confirming that yes, there is the staff will take on that process, and that'll become ours to reach out to the individual property owners, but they will have to respond if they feel that there is a concern with that operation.
I think my question was more that it would be an automatic process. As long as everything went well, they could reapply before the end of the year for a new, occupancy, and then it's automatically taken over unless there's issues with their stays or whatever Airbnb or there's issues. So.
And Eric, that renewal process is pretty much automatic, barring that they're, I mean, if they don't have to go through the process again, correct?
We would streamline it. I would think, though, that we would still probably require verification of primary residency if they didn't receive a approval by a CUP to not be their primary residence, because we want to make sure they didn't move in the year since the permit was issued and now they no longer live there, and we renew that permit automatically. So we'd want to check that, but otherwise it would be pretty simple process. It wouldn't be labor intensive, and like I said, I think our fees are going to be how much time it costs us to process it, which I don't expect to be very much time.
What about if the individuals, let's say their family member, their daughter or their son, lived in the house, but the owners don't live there? How does that work? Because she just brought this, the gentleman just brought this up before. Explain that and how is that an issue?
No, the daughter could be the one that would be the applicant in that case. You don't have to be the property owner to apply. The property owner has to sign off on the application, but if you rent a property, let's say, you could be the host for short-term rentals, and you're the one responsible, but the property owner does have to sign off on the application. So in that case, his daughter would need to be the applicant for the host, to be the host.
And just a real quick explanation on the CUP going, if there was a second room to be rented, can you just, people can do that, they just have to go through another process. Can you just, so we're not admitting that or not allowing that. It's just that they have to go to a CUP process in order to ask for that. Is that correct?
Right. So in this particular case, if he already had the approval of the 7 neighbors around them and nothing's changed, and we send the notice out for the conditional use permit hearing, and those people speak in favor of it, or we don't have objections, I don't see a reason why the planning commission wouldn't grant that to allow 2 rooms to be rented in that particular case. It's just not an automatic over the counter like the other statements or the other processes that we outlined.
And I think it's important to point out that becomes an added expense on the host, but that is what the cost would be for the city to actually process that level of effort. So that is something that does need to be taken into consideration, but we still think it's the appropriate path to take, the distinction between an over-the-counter and a CUP.
Okay. Any other, Councilmember Davis, you had a question or comment?
Yes, I want to make sure that we're not trying to provide too many answers, because those can get all tangled up. If the operator is not the person living on the property, they're going to need a conditional use permit. If the operator wants to rent 2 rooms individually, they're going to need a conditional use permit. If an operator wants to rent to a single party 1 or more rooms in their home in which they're living in, they can do an over-the-counter permit. I want to make sure people aren't trying to drive for an over-the-counter permit hoping to pay less. The key is to pay the appropriate amount for whichever permit they're going to be applying for. And there are avenues. So if the over-the-counter permit doesn't work, then they can file for a conditional use permit, and they can run that business then, as long as it's in accordance with the ordinance. I don't want to be suggesting to people that they place a family member as the host if they're not prepared to let their family member operate as a host, or to try to get around a conditional use permit. So I just want to be careful how we're discussing this. Because I don't want the city to be saying, oh no, you can just do X, Y, or Z and that'll work, when it may or may not work, because we're not clear of the whole business picture.
I think that's why we're bringing up this discussion, is to put it solid so that there is no error on someone thinking they can do something and they go through this whole function and it's wrong. And Councilmember Lau.
Well, and I think to that comment, I think I would not phrase it as you can just have someone who happens to live on the property be the host. I think the responsible party has to be the person who owns the property, that has skin in the game, right? I think you can amend the ordinance to say that there has to be an authorized representative that is on the property during the booking. And if that designee is the daughter or a family member or whatnot, I don't have a problem with that. But I think the applicant still has to be the person who actually owns the property. Because I do think we get into some wishy-washiness if it's just, oh, so-and-so can be, Joe Schmo from across the street will be my host this week. No.
Well, our cousin or my friend Vinny.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's true.
Jim, I have a question here.
Councilman
Going
Park.
along with what Wendy said, that was my concern because the first speaker mentioned purchasing another home just for rentals. And so she would have to live on the property, correct? Or a designee that is considered.
For the over-the-counter permit, yes, but she could also get a CUP and operate it as a non-owner operated or non-owner hosted short-term rental.
Okay.
Right. And I think the way for people to perhaps look at it is the ordinance is merely for over the counter, for the easy, like this is the playground that we're playing in, right? Anything that deviates from the boxes that need to be checked to be an over the counter means you go the CUP route.
CUP, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Councilmember Crosby, do you have any comments or questions?
Thank you. I just appreciate everyone's response and emails, and I like the process we're doing. The questions that have been coming up have been very valuable and clarification, and I think going through the over-the-counter and the planning commission process just to make sure that we're a bed and breakfast, a bed community and homes, and we have neighbors that we have small kids running around, and we want to make sure to protect those people at all times. And this came up because let's really talk about the elephant in the room. We had at least two residents that was abusing this, and we want to make sure that we keep our neighbors safe that live around homes, so we don't have to neighbors don't have to move away because of abusive people coming in and making their neighborly area different from when they first moved there too.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. Mr. Davis?
Yeah, there are a couple pieces I guess I want to make sure that I would want to be considered. One is that I want everybody to recognize that we're focusing on short-term rentals and how we can through the ordinance regulate appropriate and good behavior in short-term rentals, because we don't want to have to go to saying we're going to create an ordinance for all rentals, for long-term rentals, for people who are renting homes to people and they own the home but they rent it to the same family for 20 years or for 5 years or for 2 years. We don't want to have to get into that business of regulating that. We think that would indeed be too burdensome right now, but that's an alternative, right? If the short-term path doesn't work, then we'd have to figure out what we would do about long-term rentals. So under short-term rentals, I would like to make sure that I would rather than a 50% approval or concern about a property, I agree that one is too few, but because we're looking at 5 to 7 houses, if it's 5, then you're saying 3 have to complain and verse 3 out of 5, which is 60%. So I would like the ordinance to say, well, and besides that, if an over-the-counter permit doesn't work, they have the option to go down the conditional use permit avenue, because that's available to them. I would say if 2 or more neighbors complain or reject the application, then that host should have to go down the CUP method, the conditional use permit. So rather than 50%, I would argue that should be 2 or more. And the other piece is I want to make sure that we can charge TOT based on the actual length of stay. People have been using the term booking, and I understand booking to be the entire length of stay and not the reservation and not the act of reserving lodging, which can be a little bit confusing. So in the ordinance, we need to make sure if we're going to use the term booking, that booking means it's the actual length of stay, not the reservation and not the time of or the engagement of making the reservation. But I want to make sure we can charge TOT based on the actual length of stay. if it's less than 30 days, because then we can proactively use that mechanism to track short-term rentals to make sure we're getting compliance with the hosts having the permit. And if they don't pay the TOT, that becomes a misdemeanor, which we can then sue for. So that would give us more skin in the game for being able to control it. Because my concern is that we've had many short-term renters that have done well. Some of them have even gotten their permits, but some of them haven't, but they've still done well. And then we've had others that haven't cooperated as short-term renters because they're doing something that is skirting the rules. And I want to make sure that TOT is the method that we can use to put some teeth into this. So those are the pieces I would like included in this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Kress, any issues with those, or Mr. Scheer?
No, I just say that your TOT ordinance goes back many, many years, and it was never really meant to apply to this kind of situation. So we're going to be a little bit stuck with the language there. We'll see what we can do, but.
Well, are we truly stuck, or does that just mean we need to amend that language?
Yeah, well, that's a tax, and there are some that would say that if you start changing an ordinance that imposes a tax, you've got to go back to the ballot. So let me look at that.
Please look.
Yes.
Yeah, let's make sure that we're airtight on this one. Mr. Scheer, any concerns?
No, I mean, my estimate of 5 to 7 homes, to Mr. Davis's point, is an estimate, right? So sometimes there might be 10 surrounding, if depending on lot configurations, or like I said, 2. It just really depends. So thinking about in the Old Town where we have a grid pattern street layout, right? You're going to have 1 on either side, 3 behind you, roughly 3 across the street if you're in the mid block. So that's where I was kind of looking at. But up in the northern part of the city, where our streets are not in a grid pattern, that changes pretty drastically.
Would Mr. Scheer, what Mr. Davis is asking for, would that inhibit us in any way, or would that be a gauge?
It just changes the qualification, right? I mean, I don't know.
I guess I would throw that to council. Would you, I mean, that's where Councilmember Davis is, and that's fine. Are the rest of you comfortable if we bring back an ordinance that says rather than 50%, if 2 or more neighbors say we are concerned about this, the operator has to go through the CUP process? Because that's essentially what the distinction would be.
So I would throw this out there for discussion. I'm not married to any of it. I'm just going to throw this out there. So, because I do think we get a little bit fuzzy with numbers depending on neighborhoods and whatnot, right? So I think if you're going to say something like 2, limited to 2, I would have to say that it can't just be an email that says, I oppose. I would then say that it would have to be 2 with evidenced, information about why. But then that gets messy in terms of then you're trying to judge criteria versus just a straight out, you have people who are opposed. So I think those are the things I'm throwing out there to weigh out. Is it easier to work with a number to say 50%, 30% of the surrounding, neighborhood has to oppose it, or, 2 with evidentiary documentation?
And I feel more comfortable with 50%, because you could have easily 2 neighbors that will, every time you need signatures, will just stick together if they just didn't like the renter. So I think 50% opens it up a little bit more to have some leeway there to get others to give their opinions.
Mr. Crosby?
I actually agree with Robin, Council Member Carter, sorry. And because I don't want one person take away someone's livelihood if that person is doing good work. If they're not doing good work, there'll be more people coming out saying no.
Well, so I would agree if there wasn't an alternative path, that would need to be a majority. But there is an alternative path. So if somebody really wanted to pursue it and wanted to overcome an I object email, or two of them, then they can go down the CUP path, and that does require more of a discussion and more of a conversation around why someone should or should not be listened to. If we're going to go with something different than two or more, I would argue that it would let's take the 5 residents example, and I wouldn't want it to have to be 60%. So I would say 40%. And I think 40% is a little over a third. And if you can't get 2/3 of your neighbors to agree, then you're going to have to go down a CUP path.
I'm inclined to the 50% also. I understand what you're saying, Mr. Davis. I do. There are some caveats to both of these, but I'm kind of the 50% because it's just doesn't matter. Numbers don't matter. It's the 50%. It's half of whatever they have there. I just think it's an easier one to calculate and for our staff to work on.
But I think what his point is, and this is what I was trying to process, and maybe we can all think this through, is that when you have 5 houses, there is no 50%. You're not gonna half a neighbor, and so then he's saying let's err on the side of caution and say the closest to 50%, which would be the 40% if you've got 2 out of the 5 neighbors. I mean, I'm trying to think of how to wordsmith that, but I get what you're saying. 50% I have a problem with if we're always going to have numbers that we're going to be easily divisible by 2.
Right. So maybe it's 50% minus 1. It's 50% of your neighbors minus 1, and that way that you get some leeway then. Because say you're only bordered by 3 neighbors, and you're saying you've got to get 2/3 of your neighbors to agree with you. That seems harsh for a neighbor who's not engaged but yet has a problem with it.
So does this help you, Bob?
I'm happy to do it. I can try and hedge the numbers to give that. We can go back and look what some possibilities are. Let us go look at what the existing properties are that have them and see what are the actual numbers that we're facing. And then we can try and craft something and give you some proposal within the final ordinance.
Okay. Does that suffice for everyone? Any other comments or concerns?
My only, I think, comment would be with respect to the Airbnbs and the platforms. From what I understand of Airbnb, because they have faced so much, it's not necessarily litigation, because I don't think it's gone that far in some places, but in some places it has. But where there are cities that are just saying no short-term rentals at all, right? And Airbnb and those platforms don't want to be excluded from cities because that's their revenue source as well. So to the extent that we can, partner with them to make sure that they are enforcing the things that we want enforced, because as long as they want to be welcome in our city, I think that's something that we want to pursue too. Because I know that we are understaffed in terms of being able to, enforce compliance or follow through on these things. So I say let's leverage the resources that are available to us. I don't know what VRBO does, but I do know Airbnb has like community outreach and their own legal team that deals with working with cities to make sure that they can continue to do business in those cities.
Okay. Yeah, I know that they come in fell swoop. If there's an issue, they shut them down, and they shut them down hard. So I know that on many occasions, for some of like the Palm Springs or out in the beach communities, they they're in the news. But good partnership with all of the different companies would be good for us. Okay. Then your direction is Mr. Russi and Mr. Shear.
Let me capture what I think I heard, and Eric, you can jump in any time. I heard go back and look at the parking, see if we can in some way limit the number of cars that would be eligible to be permitted there. The parameters around the fines, to see if we can also get beyond what our admin side is normally as it relates to these. The TOT, and make it the actual stay versus the booking. And that will also require working back with Airbnb and those platforms to see what they have the capability of doing. Owner has to be the applicant. That was something that was expressed, and I think that had support. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Is that what I heard? Okay. And then the last one was to look at the number of residents, something that's maybe not the 50%, but based on the number, what can we get to that feels a little bit more attainable, but not just two. So with that, Eric, Bob, you have something?
Well, I guess I would ask the council, I mean, with what the city manager just went through in terms of the issues you'd like, that have been raised tonight that you'd like to have addressed, do you want to see this one more time before it goes to planning commission, public hearing, and then comes to the council? I mean,
I would like to see.
It sounds like there's a lot out there, and
yes.
I think we need to.
I would say consensus would be, let's look at it one more purview before it goes out to make sure that it captures, make sure that everything's T's are crossed and I's are dotted, and we go from there, and then we send it out. I think that's pretty.
We've still got some time with the moratorium ordinance that you extended, and this will extend the timeline that Director Shearer gave you at the beginning, by a month or so. But I think that's probably, I think you've raised enough tonight that you should see it again.
And we'll bring it back as another study session similar to this.
Okay. Everybody's good with that?
Eric, was there something? Let me make sure there wasn't something I missed in my summary, Eric.
No, I think you covered everything.
Okay.
So, quick question logistically then. So if it comes back for another study session, then whatever iteration of the ordinance with all the added clarification and information would then be disseminated so that, similar to tonight, public would have a chance to comment?
Sure.
Not the specific language necessarily, but the summary kind
right.
of what we just
Correct. Correct.
Okay. So you've been given direction. I just want to say thank you to staff, but also thank you to council. Thank you also Bob Russi. This is the kind of thing we've listened to the residents. That's the most important thing, as Mr. Crosby had stated, that we read everything the residents give us and try to implement, but to try to help all. But at the end of the day, we have to come down with some type of a ordinance that works, that's easy for the city to maintain and also police. So, but I want to thank everybody. There's great comments tonight, and the people that called in, and also all the comments from the residents. The ones that are actually doing this. It really helps us to kind of formulate what we're going to do here. So thank you all. I do appreciate it. Is there anything else, Mr. Russi?
Not that I have. I think we've got our clear direction. Thank you.
Thank you all. Then we'll adjourn at 6:20 p.m. and then we're going to have a meeting in about 10 minutes.
Perfect.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.